My name is Rabbi Josh Weinberg, and I serve as the Vice President for Israel and Reform Zionism for the Union for Reform Judaism, and as the Director of ARZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. And it is really a distinct honor to be one of the conveners of this webinar this morning, this briefing. And I'm so thankful to my friends and my colleagues, Rabbi Zweiback, Rabbi Mintz, and Rabbi Gewirtz from your three congregations for really modeling what we like to see in congregations, working together and being part of our big movement and thinking about these big ideas and the big questions that are facing us today. Of course, it is a difficult and challenging time facing Israel, people of Israel, all of her citizens, as right now we are seeing a great deal of violence and unrest sweep across the country. Just in the past week, we have seen over 1,200 rockets coming from the Gaza Strip, from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, rained down on not just the immediate area around Gaza, but the entire center of the country, the Tel Aviv and the Jerusalem corridor areas. And in just the past 24 hours, we have seen a great deal of unrest in cities throughout Israel, extremists, both Jewish extremists and Arab Palestinian extremists, taking to the streets to riot and to incite violence, which we are seeing is deeply, deeply troubling. I know how much our communities and our congregations care about Israel, feel connected about Israel, and I would say that many of our hearts are in the East right now. And we are with you, Rabbi Noa Sattath, who I'm so glad and so thankful that you have been able to make time from what must just be an incredibly challenging time for all of us, and for you especially, not only you personally, but you on behalf of the Israeli Reform Movement, Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism. And you should all know that Rabbi Noa Sattath is the director of the Israel Religious Action Center, the legal and advocacy wing of our reform movement in Israel. She is an activist, she's a rabbi, she is a teacher, and she is a modeler of someone who leads with her values. And I'm deeply honored to call her a colleague, a friend, and a teacher of mine, someone with whom I talk often and check in often on ideas and what is the best way to go, or the best course of action. And she always has wise words of wisdom to share with us. And no, I'm so glad that you are able to be with us at this time. And to begin the conversation, I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague in Los Angeles of Stephen Wise Temple, Rabbi Yoshi Zweiback.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Weinberg, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And I know, Josh, I know you're taking care of your kids today and also trying to do your best to take care of the Jewish people. And so appreciate you finding the time for us. Rabbi Noa Sattath, I really enjoyed getting to know you during my time when I was at the Hebrew Union College, excuse me, in Jerusalem, and our offices were right nearby. And I'm such an incredible fan and admirer of your work. I'm inspired by the things that you do for our movement and that you do for our people. What a difficult and challenging moment we can only imagine. I first just wanted to ask how you and your wife Netta and your three kids are managing this. I know you have little ones, a 11-year-old and then 7-year-old twins. Tell us a little bit about what it's like for you as a parent, as a spouse, in this difficult moment. What's it like? And you live in Tel Aviv, right? So what's the situation like personally?
I live in Jerusalem in a mixed neighborhood, which is where we chose to live because we wanted to go to the playground and meet Jewish and Arab kids together. And it's very strange to see things change so dramatically. So we live in a really peaceful and beautiful neighborhood, and then in the next block, cars were trashed just a few nights ago, and it's a difficult educational message to think about how you, on the one hand, are careful and we're not going out at night, and we are responding to alarms, and kids hear everything in school, and on the other hand, we're not generalizing, we're remembering all our neighbors, all of our friends who are Jewish and Arab, and all are trying to live together. So it's a complex situation. And obviously on the personal level, it's just devastating to see how extremism can take over, and it takes so much effort and such long processes to build a shared society, and it's so easy to destroy that.
Thank you, Noah. It is such an honor to have you, and we feel very privileged that you've given us this access to you in the evening in Jerusalem. And so we, first of all, appreciate the time. Second of all, your great leadership on so many incredible matters of civil life in Israel. Can you bring us up to date? People have said, well, isn't this just like every other time? Haven't we been here before? And so can you give us a little bit of an insight into the genesis of this particular moment of what's going on, how we got here, and maybe in a little bit of a prophetic way, what you see evolving out of this, if there's any hope there?
So we have been here before and we haven't been here before. And I think that that's one of the big political questions that is constantly, if you're monitoring social media like we do, I think that the big question is, for people, is why is this happening now? So some people are saying, this is happening now because Hamas decided to shoot missiles at Israel, at Jerusalem last week. And some people are saying it's because Israel is evicting homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And others are saying it's because Israel is putting a siege on millions of people in Gaza. And others are saying it's because Palestinians refuse to acknowledge Israel. And the truth is that all of these answers are right. And so in many ways, I think that the question is not why now, but how do we move forward? But I do want to stay a little bit on why this is different, specifically inside Israel and what's been going on. The past 2 years where we have had constant elections have created both an unprecedented platform for extremism in Israel on both sides, but specifically on the Jewish side, where ideas that would not have been given mainstream platforms in the past are now center stage. And we know that around the world, one of the symptoms of declining democracy is when the extreme right is taking over the center right. You've seen it in the US, it's happening around the world, and it's happening in Israel, specifically where our democratic structure is more fragile. And since we've been going through this cycle of elections, and in this time of elections, one of the things that has not happened is the nomination of a new chief of police. And so the Israeli police has been without a commander for 2 years, and then recently there was a commander there that was nominated that is viewed as inappropriate. And so while this extremism has been going on, we had a chief of police who tried to change the rules of Ramadan, which is very, very central everywhere to Muslims everywhere and in Israel. And so the rioting in the streets inside Israel has begun 3-4 weeks ago during Ramadan, when the chief of police changed the rules and closed the main gathering area for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And so there was a very violent response to that. And even though a couple of weeks after the riots began, the space was reopened, the rioting has not stopped, and it has filtered from Jerusalem, which actually Jerusalem is peaceful now. It's much more peaceful than it has been in the past, to other cities in Israel, where we've seen rioting that I don't think has ever happened in Israel, in terms of just people in the streets. For the first time since 67, there was a curfew last night on one of the mixed cities, Lod, which is near the Ben Gurion airport. I think tonight there will be more curfews in more cities. The curfew was ineffective, and basically gangs of both Arabs and Jews are rioting in the streets, perpetrating acts of violence. Last night we saw on the news a gang of Jews lynching an Arab in Bat Yam, and a gang of Arabs lynching a Jew in Akko. really going through the same motions of finding the person of the different nationality, pulling them out of the car, and beating them. And that's very, it's devastating, it's shocking, it's terrifying, and we're seeing attempts from leaders on all sides to stop this, and we'll see how effective that is tonight.
So Noah, I want to add my profound gratitude for you being here. My last trip that I led, you were actually one of our speakers, and we followed you to the Kotel the next day for Rosh Chodesh and experienced that whole wonderful conflict that exists, which would be a time for another conversation. So thank you for being. I also want to say that there's a real sense of conflict for American Jews because we feel so connected to Israel, I hope, and also as our spiritual homeland, and also really are careful about what we say because our feet are not on the ground the way that yours are. We're watching the sirens, we're reading the articles and watching the videos of lynchings, but we're not there. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for representing us in ways that are so important. If you could dig down, a little bit into the nationalism, the ultra extremism on each of the sides. I don't think people understand here. We're dealing, believe it or not, with a pretty fragile democracy here right now, and their extremist tendencies, and we're having a hard time understanding that on our own soil. Can you dig down a little bit and tell us what characterizes it and where it emanates from, and where do you think it's going to go, and is it going to get worse?
So my work has really become easier in the past 5-6 years. I used to come to the US and sit in front of wonderful congregations in Connecticut or California and ask myself, 7 years ago, how can I convey to these wonderful Jews here what it's like when there's a leader who incites to violence and is corrupt and disregards all the norms and is indifferent to democracy. And I think that now we are closer in an understanding and people have a clearer view of what it's like. I think that in Israel, Israel is a younger democracy, so younger democracies are more fragile. And we have no constitution. A constitution is very, very helpful when you're trying to defend democracy. So Israel has no constitution. It has only one house of parliament, where most democracies have two. And there's a very weak separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch, which is also a weak point for democracy. So we're in a worse starting point than many other places. I think one of the things that people might find interesting is the link between Judaism and the attempt to destroy democracy. And so in Israel, it is some of the discourse is centered on the Jewish identity, meaning the anti-democratic elements, where we do not value equality, where we do not protect civil rights, where we do not have to treat minorities equally. And the democratic side, where we do have to protect all those things. So in the discourse, which is why I think our work in the movement is so essential, it's a type of division between the Jewish side, which is basically a Jewish supremacist side, and the democratic side. And we are trying to both demonstrate and create the narrative that these are not conflicting values, these are overlapping values. Because this is a Jewish state, we have to promote equality. It's not because this is a democratic state that we have to promote equality. And so this is where the situation is now. And on the one hand, we are part of this alarming trend of democratic fragility. On the other hand, I think that it, as a testament to the enormous resistance movements that we have here, and our justices and our political leaders on the left and on the center and some on the right, despite this constant attack on democracy and despite the challenging starting point, the Israeli democracy is holding on. And in fact, the anti-democratic forces are not able to form a government, even in this fourth election that we've had in 2 years. And I think it's too early to tell right now whether we will have what is called a government of change, which will replace Prime Minister Netanyahu and try to reestablish our democratic norms, or whether we will go for a fifth round of elections. But this is the struggle of our lifetime. This is the struggle for the soul of Israel and for democracy in Israel, and that's what we're up against. And I'm looking at what's happening here, and I'm reminded of the January 6th attack on Congress, where it gets really crazy before the anti-democratic leader has to leave. So I'm hopeful that this is what we're seeing right now.
Thank you, Noah, and I love what you said about how, we're not a democracy in spite of, or there's not a conflict between that notion that we're a Jewish democratic state. These values are really mutually reinforcing and very much compatible, which I think is so important. You talked about the new government. What's your sense of where this is going to go next? Obviously, it's such a dynamic situation in the midst of all of this violence and all of this upheaval. We're having, this attempt at another new coalition. There are some people who've said that some of what's happening is in a very cynical way, perhaps designed by the current prime minister to be able to hold on to power. What are your thoughts about what's going to come next? Will we have a new government? And if so, will it be Yair Lapid? Who's going to be able to put that government together?
Before Sunday, which is when the attacks really began, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett were very close to forming a government. And the negotiations, as far as I understand it, to form a government between the 7 parties that have to be in it are still continuing. It is a very difficult time for both the leaders on the right and the Arab party. At least one of the Arab parties has to sign on to the agreements to actually right now communicate on the same wavelength. Although they're not, the messaging seems coordinated, it is a big challenge for them. It's a very big stretch. So I think that they all have an interest to continue to build a government. Yair Lapid has 21 more days to build a government. And he can get an extension of 14 more days if he needs it. So I think the chances are good, but it's not done. Until it's done, it's not done. It's gonna take, I think that every single one of the parties has an interest in forming the government. Nobody wants a fifth elections. I think Netanyahu has demonstrated how dangerous he is. And I think we're close, but it does not mean that this is for sure. And it does not mean that we are out of the woods for fifth elections. I think that the scenario for Netanyahu government is unlikely. It's not a 0%, but it's unlikely at this point.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's, I'm sure it's very difficult for anybody. It is for us, but for you to predict what it's going to look like tomorrow, let alone in the formation of the next government. I'm thinking right now about my own kids, Noah, and one who's turning 21, one who's 25, and the anguish that young Americans feel who have grown up with a certain narrative, whatever their particular narrative is. And I'm thinking about young people in Israel and this next generation. And I'm not saying that any of us are not young, that we're no longer young, but we have reached a point where we're in a different generation where we have children that have different engagements with the sense of homeland, the sense of Israel, the sense of who are we in relationship to Israelis and Palestinians. And I feel that sense of anguish from our young people. And I know for the young people in Israel thinking about the future. Is there a sense of hope for them? How can we re-engage? How can we continue to have inspiration and hope? When my experience right now is many American Jewish kids, whether they're in high school, college, or millennials, are turning away. There's a sense of embarrassment, of shame, of fear in terms of the anti-Semitism that is coming out of the anti-Zionism in our country. So can you speak to that in terms of what can we do for this next generation who's going to inherit what's happening right now?
That's a great question. I first of all, I think that, and that's the question, that's where I look at Rabbi Weinberg and all of you and the roles that the enormous responsibility and role that you have. I think that the tension here is between two major narratives that I hear with younger North American Jews. One is the Israeli government Hezbollah narrative. Israel can do no wrong. There's no partner. The IDF is the most moral army in the world, and it's working for a narrow part of this age group, but mostly younger people are rejecting this narrative altogether. And the second very compelling narrative is saying there's a huge moral crisis in Israel, and our response is BDS. And BDS is very compelling because it's very clear what you have to do. And I think that what our movement is doing is, and it's really difficult in this time of very short attention spans, is developing the middle narrative, saying there's a huge moral crisis in Israel, and our response is to engage more and to be more involved and to be part of the solution. And I think that the first of all, the first step to that is talking openly about the problems and not being afraid of that. And I know that that's difficult because everything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about context, and about, what kind of double standards you're using. But I think we need to develop that ability so that we have the credibility with our younger generation to really seek ways to be part of the solution. And in this time, I think that on the one hand, it is clear what the challenges are, and we're not facing simple odds. I wish I could tell you that, we're very close to finding this answer to the, by next week, I'll have the whole thing sorted out for you. But this is not, we don't have a simple path. But the only way that we're going to find the path and reach the end of it is if we walk it together. And the right wing is getting a lot of support from North American Jews, not Reform mostly, but there's a huge amount of support pouring out to the right. And the North American liberals are very conflicted about the engagement, which leaves us liberals much more isolated. And this is the time where we need all the help that we can get, and all the wisdom and all the resources and all the support and the community that we can pull together. So I think that this is why this work that you're doing to connect younger Jews to Israel is essential for not only for the future of your congregations, where being identified with Israel is a big part of who you are as Jews in North America, but it's also essential for us as we're struggling to create change in Israel.
So Noah, let's see if we can dig a little bit further into that, because the one thing that, many things, but one of the things that's really makes us fearful as North American rabbis is that Jews used to be united around Israel vis-a-vis support. And it's not just a younger generation, but there are pieces of the left and the right, but specifically a lot of attention has been moved to the left about the Ilhan Omars and the Rashida Tlaibs and these people on the left who feel like if you support Israel, then you no longer can support all of the other issues that liberals would traditionally support. So you go out to an anti-immigration ban, which was a big issue here several years ago. And at the same place, you'll see anti-Israel rhetoric. And on one hand, immediately it feels like it's anti-Semitic, because why aren't other countries held to the same standard? And on the other hand, people use language on the left here that people in Israel use, but they don't seem to connect. And we are very worried about people who are steadfastly left, but are beginning to drift away from Israel, and perhaps are even acting in ways that feel anti-Semitic. I know it's not your country to react to, but how do you react to in terms of giving us advice of how to help people navigate, not just young people, it's cross-generational now in some ways.
Yeah. Building alliances is so complicated. I was in the Negev this week with the unrecognized Bedouin villages, and I sat there. It was 110 degrees. It was Ramadan. They were fasting, and they don't have electricity. They have solar panels, but it's not enough to sustain air conditioning. And we're sitting there in the heat. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is crazy. They have no water and no electricity. And what do they want? They want to vote. This is what they're asking us to do, to help us make them vote. And on the other hand, these are people who have multiple wives in a very, very sexist society that is hard to look at. And I think that it's often that we create these relationship and alliances with people that we can align on. And we've been working with the Bedouin communities for a long time, but this plight to vote is something that there's a lot of voter suppression in the Bedouin communities, and we've worked on that in past elections. And that's, if we're going to the 5th elections, that's going to be our major issue. And so just in general, I think that for social change, you align with people on a specific cause, and you don't have to align with them on everything. And I think that one of the things that is hard for us is to be very centered around who we are as Zionists. I think that criticizing Israel is not anti-Zionist. I think that you're saying they're criticizing Israel out of context and using double standards, which is difficult for me to sustain. And I think that a good response would be, I'm working on that. You're upset about the occupation. Me too, I'm working on that. But why is this relevant here? And why is this double standard enforced? I think that that's what we can both be. I think one of the things that we need to redefine is, what does it mean to support Israel? And I think that we need to redefine that for the younger generation. Supporting Israel is not supporting the occupation. It's not supporting the settlements. It's supporting the Israel that we believe in the value, and trying to bring the values that we believe in to Israel. But I get the complexity of the situation. It's not like I don't know what the simple solution is. I think that the more credibility that we have in addressing the wrongs in Israel, the easier it will become for us to build the relationships where we can talk about both what we're doing to address the solution and the double standards and the anti-Semitic overtones that are existing there.
And I just want to say, Yoshi's about to jump in, but that when there's bloodshed, it becomes even harder to talk about those things, because immediately, and I feel this to a certain degree also, like at this point, it's all support all the time, because the most important thing to me right now is the survival of the Jewish people, of Israel. And yet when someone even intimates a critique, the other side comes out and says, you must be against Israel. But it becomes really treacherous when blood is spilling all over the place.
Yeah. Exactly. It's exactly right. And, Noah, when you were talking about your experience with, in the Bedouin tent, I'm thinking of Rabbi Hugo Grinn's famous story about how, we can go a few weeks without food and a few days without water, but you can't go 5 minutes without hope. And so, there you are in the heat of that tent, but what is it that folks wanted was the opportunity to have their voices heard and have their voices counted. And I was thinking about the connection to this week's Torah portion, when, Laseit Rosh, to take a census is to look into every person's eyes and say, your story matters, you count, no more or less than I do. And as Matthew said, this is one of those moments where we emotionally and for all sorts of other reasons, we want to stand up and say, yes, but our lives are in jeopardy, and the lives of people we care about are in jeopardy, and people like our friend Noah and Netta and their 3 children are traumatized by all of this, and so we want to respond. So anyway, I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for raising that. I want to bring in a question from one of our attendees. It's our colleague, Rabbi Joel Mossbacher. Thank you, Joel, for joining us. And he asked if he asked, hypothetically, let's say you were a rabbi, hypothetically, and you were going to address a Reform synagogue in the United States this Shabbat, what would be the most important message you'd want those synagogue members to walk away with about this moment in Israel?
I think, my phone is buzzing with photos of demonstrations that were organized. All of them were organized this morning of Jews and Arabs in Israel standing together against violence. And I want us to always remember that the strength of extremism is in a vacuum. And this is up to all of us now to raise the voices of moderation. And the vast majority of Israelis, both Jews and Arabs, are invested in shared society. We see our neighbors. We want to live together. We want to build hope. From the right, from the extreme right, almost, not the Kahanis, but from the extreme right to the Arab parties, all of the leaders have denounced this. Religious leaders have been working together to end this violence. And so I would hate for Reform Synagogue this week to say bad Arabs are attacking Israelis, or bad Jews are attacking Arabs. I would talk about how extremism can rise in a vacuum and how we need to raise the big effort of moderates in Israel to create a hope for a shared future in the coming days.
I love the way that you said that there, that we really all know, especially as rabbis, how important relationships are. And that if we can, from the far right to the far left, even though the values are not the same, the idea of coexistence, even within our own community, is so important. We talk about coexistence between Arabs and Jews, but not a lot about the coexistence that we need between Jews and Jews in Israel. And that brings me to shift a little bit towards, everybody who is on this call is living through a place in history that I don't believe, I could not have imagined us in terms of religious extremism, and in terms of what is going on with our particular governments at this particular time. So I'm thinking about the last 4 years and the relationship between the Trump administration and Netanyahu's government, and the American relationship to Israel. And are you hopeful that the Biden-Harris administration is going to be shifting that relationship? Because I know for so many of us, we want to be supportive of that relationship. And it's been very difficult for many American Jews to be supportive of the American administration's relationship with Israel over the last 4 years. Not all, obviously. As you said, there's that slice of young American Jews who say Israel right or wrong, Israel right. So there's obviously a slice of American life that was very supportive of Trump's version of a relationship with Israel.
Absolutely. I think we had this habit of doing before every election, we were preparing for an emergency scenario, an anti-democratic emergency scenario that thankfully did not happen this election. But we sit in this group of organizations that are protecting democracy. And since we've been doing this for a while, we tried to say, what did we gain we had that meeting right before the fourth elections. What did we gain in the past 2 years of elections? And so we spoke at length about the resistance movement that has developed in Israel during these past 2 years. And the other significant thing was the change in the American administration. I always like to tell this story about the effect of the Trump administration on Israel. We at IRAC work very closely with the Knesset, And every Sunday, Knesset members submit their bills on the table for a vote on Wednesday. And we review that there are hundreds of them, very few of them pass. And we look at all of them and we see if there's anything that we need to challenge or anything that we want to support. And in November 2016, there were 2 bills on the Knesset table that were brought to me. One about banning the call of the muazzin, the Muslim call to prayer, and another to appropriate private Palestinian lands. I was looking at these bills submitted by crazy radicals in the Knesset, and I said, you know, I shooed the staff person out of the room and said, these have no chance of passing. And all of my colleagues in the different social change organizations were brushing these off. And then Trump was elected on Tuesday, and on Wednesday, these bills passed. One day is all it took, because the US government is such an important check and balance on the Israeli democracy. And we do not yet have a new American ambassador to Israel. We're thinking that one will be nominated this month, but it's a huge shift for us. And we've seen the calming effect of the Biden administration's behavior in the past weeks. I can imagine a very, very different response from a Trump administration. So on a very practical level, I think it's essential. And also on a global level, I'm a democracy crisis buff. I like to learn about these different things. And I got a meeting with the German Counselor for Human Rights. So she is a political representative, and she was in Israel, and before that she was in Egypt, and she was going to Gaza, and she was in Brazil and the Philippines. And I had this meeting with her, and I really wanted to ask her who figured it out. Where in the world were the populist leaders defeated, and how? And her response to me was nowhere. There was nowhere. Populism is so strong right now. It was this meeting was in 2019. Populism is so strong, and there are no local forces who managed to defeat it. And the fact that populism was defeated in the US politically is amazing. It gives hope to all of the people who are struggling for democracy around the world. It's essential. It's such a, Rabbi Zweiback spoke about hope. It is so important to have this hope and model for a way to win and promote democracy.
So listen, if anyone does what we do for a living, we sort of hang our hats on hope, right? I mean, we get up each morning somehow trying to make our glass even fuller than we might have imagined it to be. If you were going to suggest, I know you're not a politician, but you're representing living there, and we're not. What is something that the Israeli side can do and the Palestinian side could do to help convince the other, in this immediate moment, to de-escalate, right? The first thing you got to do is end bloodshed, to de-escalate, and then to do something that might be some kind of trust-building measure that might move this to a different stage, because the last few years, all we've seen is an uptick in violence every once in a while, but never do we see anything that might lead to any sense of hope that there could be peace in any regard, 2-state, 1-state, whatever it is. So how would you answer that?
I think that if Arab Knesset members are a part of the next Israeli government, that's a huge first step. There are 3 populations of, or maybe even 4 populations of Arabs between the Jordan and the sea. One is Israeli citizens. 21% of the Israeli population is Arab, and they vote to the Knesset. They have representatives, and their representatives have usually been outside the government. And actually, Netanyahu has been the one delegitimizing them. During this election campaign, because he's losing votes, he has embraced the Islamist faction as a close friend, because they are conservative in some senses. And in that way, he has opened the floor for participation of the representatives of the Arab minority in Israel in government. And I think that could lead to a change. I want to say that in this very dark time, the foundation of the occupation is the racist dehumanization of Arabs in Israel. The long-standing effort to say these people are not like us, and I think that on many levels this is a time of hope. During the catastrophe on Mount Meron, where there was wow, I don't have the word for in English for what happened.
Over the destruction, all the caving in and the
caving in, and the death. There were 100,000 people in the north, most of them were ultra-Orthodox, who were stuck there that night. And Mount Meron is surrounded by Arab towns and villages. And the Arab towns who were in Ramadan, they all came out and they offered people a place to stay, and they offered people water and food. And there was such a sense of unification. And also what we're seeing today in the streets in Israel, people are saying, we want to build a future together. So I think it's very confusing in many places. Both the democratic trends and the anti-democratic trends are both getting stronger. But I think we need to pay attention to the fact that there is more unity. On some level, we're seeing these awful riots in the streets that are a result of long-term neglect. But on the other hand, we're also seeing people coming together like never before. And so that could be the change that you're looking for.
And from the Palestinian side, I'm getting comments here as I'm talking on my phone, and you're saying, wait a minute, we're talking about Hamas that says out loud, we'd like to end Israel's existence. So what can the Palestinians do to help people come back to the middle from the Israeli side?
You mean from the Palestinian side?
Well, to help Israelis who keep on going further and further away from it because they feel like, wait a minute, they only want to destroy us. How can we come further to the center? Again, this is the perception. So what can the Palestinians do to help Israelis feel like there's a partner there?
I think that, for example, Emanu-El, who is the leader of the Joint Arab faction, Hamas has called Israeli Arabs to riot and to create havoc. And he, in his response, was very inspiring in saying, we resist the occupation, but this is not our way. We're not going to be violent. And I think that is the kind of model that we want. And we know that one of the many fragilities of Israeli democracy is that anti-democratic leaders often use an imagined enemy, immigrants or drug dealers in Philippines and in Brazil, to say, somebody's coming after us, which is why we need to, forget all of our democratic norms. In Israel, there is an enemy. There's a real enemy, and it's Palestinian, but it's not the majority of the Palestinians. The more the Israeli side acknowledges that, the more we have allies with the Palestinians. The more we regard all Palestinians as enemies, the Palestinians will become our enemies. And that's how we need to balance this.
Thank you so much. I want to, I just have one more question, and we also want to make sure that everybody on here, and I think either Sid or Matthew will put it in the chat there, just a reminder of a couple of upcoming events that the three of us are doing together. We actually have one this afternoon where we're going to be studying together leading up to Shavuot, but 2 weeks from today, we're going to be interviewing another Noah Tishby, about her new book, about Israel, so we can continue some of these conversations. I saw a post this morning. I'm actually going to share it because I want people to be able to see it. It's so beautiful. I saw a post this morning on Facebook from Rabbi Michael Marmer, who was Noah's teacher and my teacher, and Sydney and Matthew's. Is the past dean of the Hebrew Union College Jerusalem campus, and also the provost. The past provost of HUC, and he's currently the board chair of Rabbis for Human Rights. And this is what he posted today. The sight of my fellow Jews marching through the streets of many of Israel's cities shouting death to Arabs and vengeance should not be downplayed or contextualized. Knowing that such acts have been mirrored on the Arab side with similarly lethal results only makes the situation worse. This hatred mired in grief and fear, fueled by misinformation, empowered by politicians, may be more of a threat to Israel than all the rockets of Hamas and Hezbollah combined. I wonder how you would respond to that.
I think. First of all, yeah, what a blessing to have such a teacher, right? Who could have said that better? And on the other hand, I totally agree, and I think I didn't sleep last night. I watched the news on all 3 of the Israeli news channels that are broadcasting nonstop depressing images, and most of the people said that. And I think that Israel is very strong, and there's no existential threat from Hamas. This is traumatizing. This is horrific. We've had a 5-year-old boy die in Sderot last night, and it's an immense tragedy. We had a 16-year-old Palestinian Israeli who died this week as well. But this is not the existential threat to Israel. Israel can resist these rockets. Hamas has a minuscule army. Israel has a huge army. The real threat is how we build a future together, because all of us, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, we are here to stay. Nobody's going anywhere. And we have to see this not as a curse that we have to live here together. We have to find the blessing in it. We have to see it as our calling to live together on this land equally, and all of us in security. That's the long-term crisis. And I think that the people who are rioting in the streets have lost the hope for that, and we need to figure out a way to inspire them to continue.
Thank you so much, Noah. We're deeply appreciative. I know it's bedtime for your 3 kids, and you told us right before we started that because of this webinar, they got extra cartoon time. So,
yes, they are very grateful. Thank you to everybody who participated. My kids are appreciative. They had a much nicer dinner than me questioning them about school. And I want to thank everybody who came here. I know that this is a confusing time about Israel, and I'm thanking you for caring about us. We feel this love coming to us from our brothers and sisters around the world. And I want to thank you for staying engaged and keep asking the difficult questions. It's through those difficult questions that we find the path that we're looking for. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for caring about Israel.
We do, and I'm so glad that you feel that, Rabbi. I said to Rabbi Zweiback and Rabbi Gewirtz, 5 rabbis. Should we invite some more? And who else who we have together this afternoon, and tonight, all around the world. And I just want to I want to remind all of us who are here today, if we weren't here, we wouldn't be inspired by our national anthem, which is just simply the word Hatikva. And Hatikva is so much of what you have been talking to us about. So you fill us with Hatikva, and through very, very dark times, we are engaged, we're staying engaged, and we send our prayer for the peace of Jerusalem, and our prayers for your family, you and your wife and the kids, and for everybody you work with, and for the holy work that you continue to do on behalf of all of us in the United States and around the world. We are so grateful to you. And so we offer you that blessing and all the strength that we have, and we are staying engaged, as painful and difficult as this time is. And we look forward to seeing you. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim.
Yeah,
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
God bless. And we'll be in touch with all of you soon, folks. Continue to join with us. We pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Noah, thank you.